Salmokji Reservoir, the water that remembers. There are places in South Korea that look completely ordinary in daylight. They have no ruined buildings, no abandoned hospitals, no ancient castles, and no obvious reason to frighten anyone. Salmokji Reservoir, hidden among the rural hills of Yesan County in South Chungcheong Province, is one of those places. During the day, it can look almost peaceful, a small body of water surrounded by trees, farmland, narrow roads, and quiet countryside. But after darkness falls, the same landscape has acquired a reputation that has lasted for years. People have reported strange figures, unexplained experiences, navigation problems, and encounters with what they describe as spirits connected to the water. None of these supernatural claims has been scientifically established. Yet the stories have become so persistent that Salmokji developed a reputation as one of Korea's unsettling paranormal locations long before it became famous through cinema. The most important thing about Salmokji is that it is not a fictional horror location invented for a movie. The reservoir is real. It was constructed in 1982 to provide agricultural water, making it a relatively modern rural reservoir rather than some mysterious ancient lake. Local officials have described it as a small agricultural reservoir in Gwangsea Mayan, and another nearby reservoir, Bugwangi, was constructed around the same period, giving the two bodies of water something of a twin-like appearance. To local residents, Salmokji was simply part of the countryside, a functional piece of infrastructure surrounded by familiar hills and villages. And that is what makes the legend so unsettling. The reservoir did not become famous because of some officially documented massacre or confirmed supernatural incident. Instead, its reputation grew through stories passed between people, paranormal programs, online communities, and visitors who claimed to have experienced something they could not explain. Korean media have repeatedly described Salmokji as a place associated with reported ghost sightings, while also making clear that these accounts remain unverified. In other words, the frightening history of Salmokji exists in an uncomfortable space between documented geography and undocumented experience. One of the oldest and most persistent stories concerns what supposedly existed before the reservoir was built. According to local legend, there was once a settlement in the area that was eventually submerged when the reservoir was constructed. Some versions of the story go further, claiming that a cemetery was also located there. The implication is horrifying, that the reservoir may have covered not only the remains of an old landscape, but graves as well. If that were true, then the dark water would literally be covering a forgotten place of the dead. But there is an important problem. The claim about the cemetery has not been historically verified. Reports citing local authorities have stated that there is no documentary confirmation establishing that a cemetery existed beneath the reservoir. Even the mayor of Yesan, speaking in April 2026, acknowledged that the historical claims surrounding the place had not been verified. Yet legends do not always require documents to survive. For years, Salmokji developed a reputation among people interested in Korean folklore and paranormal stories. It was reportedly discussed on television programs devoted to supernatural accounts, and stories about strange encounters began circulating online. The location's isolation helped the legends grow. At night, there are fewer people, fewer lights, and fewer familiar landmarks. Roads become difficult to distinguish from paths. The reservoir becomes a large black surface surrounded by darkness. And when a person is already expecting to encounter something frightening, every unexplained sound can suddenly become significant. That is where the legend of the Molgwisan, or water ghost, becomes particularly disturbing. Korean folklore has long contained stories of spirits associated with water, especially spirits of people who died by drowning. These entities are often imagined as beings that remain connected to the place where they died. In the stories surrounding Salmokji, the water itself becomes the source of the danger. The fear is not simply that something might appear beside the reservoir. The fear is that something might be waiting beneath it. Some modern retellings describe strange figures appearing around the reservoir. Others involve people feeling watched while standing near the water. There are also stories involving navigation systems supposedly directing travelers toward the reservoir or toward areas where they should not go. These accounts remain anecdotal rather than verified incidents, but their repetition has become part of Salmokji's modern mythology. One particularly disturbing story circulated through Korean supernatural media. A visitor reportedly claimed that a navigation system led her toward the reservoir at night, almost directing the vehicle toward the water. She later associated a series of misfortunes with the visit. Whether this was caused by a supernatural force, an ordinary navigation error, poor visibility, or the confusing rural roads is impossible to establish. But the story became powerful precisely because the technology involved was something people normally trust. A map is supposed to tell you where you are. A navigation system is supposed to tell you where to go. So what happens when the machine guiding you appears to be leading you somewhere you should never go? That question would eventually become central to Salmokji's horror mythology. Years later, filmmaker Lee Sang-min became fascinated by the location and its atmosphere. Rather than inventing an entirely fictional haunted reservoir, he used the real Salmokji as the foundation for a horror story. The resulting movie, Salmokji, Whispering Water, follows a filming crew that travels to the reservoir after mysterious figures are captured in road view footage. What begins as a professional assignment becomes a descent into supernatural terror. The movie was released on April 8, 2026. And something strange happened. People began visiting the real reservoir. Not during the day. At night. The success of the film transformed Salmokji from an obscure rural location into a destination for people looking for a real-life horror experience. Reports described vehicles traveling toward the reservoir late at night, with some accounts describing extremely large numbers of cars arriving in the early morning hours. One report said that a map application showed more than 200 vehicles heading towards Salmokji around 10 p.m. Imagine that scene. It is deep into the night. The countryside is supposed to be silent. Then headlights begin appearing along the narrow roads. One vehicle. Then another. Then another. People who have just watched a horror movie are driving toward the very location that inspired it. Some arrive carrying cameras. Some want photographs. Some want proof that the legends are real. Others simply want to experience the fear for themselves. And suddenly, the haunted reservoir has become crowded. But the popularity created a serious problem. The roads around the reservoir are narrow, and reports described congestion and parking difficulties. Authorities became concerned about accidents, especially because people were arriving in darkness and approaching a body of water. Yesan County subsequently introduced measures to restrict nighttime access and warned visitors not to approach the reservoir after dark. Officials also warned people against camping, cooking, fishing, and littering at the site. That detail is important. Because whatever you believe about ghosts, the physical danger of the reservoir is real. Dark water is dangerous. Unfamiliar roads are dangerous. A remote reservoir with poor visibility is dangerous. And a crowd of frightened people searching for supernatural experiences in the middle of the night can create even more danger. But then came another story. During the production of Salmokji, Whispering Water, actress Kim Hye-yoon described an unsettling story told by a member of the film crew. According to her account, a staff member reportedly saw what appeared to be a small child walking in the distance. There was something wrong with the sight. The weather was cold enough for people to be wearing padded jackets. But the child appeared to be wearing only a sleeveless shirt. The staff member watched as the child moved past. Then the person reportedly noticed the child's shoulders moving strangely as it walked. The child disappeared. Later, at the accommodation where the crew was staying, a sensor light reportedly began flickering repeatedly. According to Kim's account, someone jokingly, or perhaps nervously, told the light to stop by the count of 3. And it stopped. Kim later described the incident as frightening enough that people worried something might have followed them from the filming location. But again, there is a line between a reported experience and a proven supernatural event. There is no independent evidence establishing that the child was a ghost. There is no scientific evidence proving that the sensor light was responding to a spirit. There is no verified record demonstrating that an entity followed the crew. It remains a story told by people connected with the production. And perhaps that uncertainty makes it more frightening. Because a confirmed ghost story can be dismissed as fiction. An unexplained experience leaves a question. What did they actually see? The film itself became extraordinarily successful. By May 2026, Salmokji, Whispering Water had passed 3 million admissions, and shortly afterward it surpassed A Tale of Two Sisters to become the most watched Korean horror film according to reported box office figures. And with every ticket sold, more people learned the name Salmokji. The real reservoir became inseparable from the movie. Visitors who had never heard of the place began searching for it online. People started sharing photographs. People drove there after midnight. People talked about the stories. And the legend grew. That is the strange thing about haunted places. Sometimes the fear does not begin with a ghost. It begins with a story. Someone tells someone else that something happened there. The second person tells a third. A television program repeats it. A YouTube channel tells it again. A photograph appears. A movie dramatizes it. Millions of people watch. And eventually, the story becomes part of the identity of the place itself. Salmokji is now caught inside that cycle. The reservoir existed before the horror movie. The legends existed before the movie. But the movie gave those legends a much larger audience. And suddenly, people who had never visited the area began imagining what might be beneath its surface. Consider the water itself. During the day, a reservoir can appear harmless. The surface reflects the sky. Trees move in the wind. Birds pass overhead. Nothing seems unusual. But after sunset, the same water becomes almost impossible to read. You cannot see its depth. You cannot see the bottom. You cannot see what lies several meters beneath the surface. The reflection of trees can look like shadows. A ripple can look like movement. A distant light can appear to hover over the water. And if you already believe that something is waiting beneath the surface, your mind begins filling in what your eyes cannot see. That may be the real horror of Salmokji. Not knowing. Not being able to prove what happened. Not knowing whether the figure someone saw was a person, an animal, a shadow, or something else. Not knowing whether the navigation system made an ordinary mistake or whether the road really seemed to pull someone toward the water. Not knowing whether the old cemetery story is historical fact or simply a legend created after the reservoir was built. And not knowing whether the strange things reported by visitors are supernatural experiences or the product of darkness, isolation, fear, and expectation. There is another unsettling detail. The reservoir's name itself sounds ominous to many people. Some have interpreted Salmokji as if it were an inherently sinister name. But reports indicate that the name is not simply a dark phrase meaning something like killing trees. Local explanations connect the name to the area's geography and vegetation rather than to a supernatural history. So even the name has become part of the mythology. A normal place begins to sound frightening once people attach frightening meanings to it. And that is how haunted places are born. Not necessarily from one event. Sometimes from hundreds of small stories. A strange sound. A figure in the distance. A road that feels unfamiliar. A light that turns on by itself. A fisherman who refuses to explain what he saw. A local resident who says, "Don't go there at night." Then another person repeats the warning. And another. Until eventually nobody remembers exactly where the story began. By 2026, Salmokji had reached a strange new chapter. The place that had once been associated with quiet rural life became a horror destination. The very success of the film created real-world consequences. People came looking for ghosts. But the authorities had to remind them that there were real hazards. The water did not need a ghost to be dangerous. The darkness did not need a spirit to make someone lose their way. The narrow roads did not need a curse to become dangerous when hundreds of vehicles arrived. And perhaps that is the most disturbing lesson of Salmokji. A legend can transform a real place. A movie can transform a legend. And millions of viewers can transform a quiet reservoir into something almost mythological. But when the cameras are turned off and the movie ends, the water remains. Dark. Silent. Impossible to see through. The old stories remain too. Some say the reservoir hides a forgotten cemetery. There is no documentary proof that it does. Some say spirits of the drowned remain beneath the water. There is no scientific evidence that they do. Some visitors say they saw figures. Others report strange experiences. None of these accounts has been independently established as paranormal. And yet people still went there. They drove through the darkness. They stood beside the water. They pointed their cameras toward the black surface. And they waited. Perhaps they were hoping to capture a ghost. Perhaps they were hoping to prove that the stories were false. Or perhaps, deep down, they wanted the stories to be true. Because there is something irresistible about standing beside dark water and wondering what might be looking back. So if you ever hear the name Salmokji, remember the distinction between history and legend. The reservoir is real. The 1982 construction is real. The rural landscape is real. The paranormal reputation is real as a cultural phenomenon. The reports of strange encounters are real as reported stories. The 2026 movie is real. The enormous wave of nighttime visitors is real. The safety restrictions are real. But the ghosts? That remains the unanswered question. And perhaps that is exactly why Salmokji continues to frighten people. Because if someone proves that there is nothing beneath the water, the legend dies. But if nobody can prove it, the water keeps it secret. And somewhere beneath the dark surface of a quiet reservoir in Yesan, the stories continue to whisper. Not loudly. Not clearly. Just enough to make you wonder whether the sound you heard beside the water was the wind, a ripple, a distant animal, or something that was never supposed to come back to the surface.